Jerry, where were you born?
Trenton, New Jersey.
How did you learn to draw?
By drawing. I never studied art. I started as a journalist.
Were you encouraged at school and at home?
Not really. No, because it was just a hobby, and I drew for the high school paper, cartoon, but I was an editor of the paper, mostly doing reporting and writing. And I wanted to be a journalist. That's how I started. I went to New York to study journalism at Columbia and got into cartooning accidentally, and I just thought it was a way to earn my way through college.
What was your first paid job? How did you actually start making money?
The year I graduated high school, which was 39, believe it or not, I sold ice cream that summer on a bicycle with a cart behind it. We didn't have motorized ice cream wagons in those days. And I sold ice cream for the summer to earn money for the first year in college. My folks were just getting out of the Depression, and I knew it would be difficult for them, so I was trying to earn my way. I was on, I think, the 98-pound track team and tennis team. I was always very active and very thin. By the end of the summer, paddling back and forth, selling the ice cream, I think I was down to about 78 pounds. So my mother thought I'd never survive the first semester at college, so she insisted I'd take $25 to go away to the mountains and fatten up for a week so that I would live through the first semester. So I reluctantly did, because I added up in my mind how many ice cream cones I had to sell. I figured $1.50 royalty or so to accumulate $25. I guess it was the easiest place to get to in the Poconos. I immediately went out to play tennis, and I put on my tennis jacket as a warm-up jacket. Well, that warm-up jacket was a white linen painter's jacket, which was the fad at that time at colleges, and decorate them with, I guess, the equivalent of our graffiti today. So I did, and I naturally drew cartoons all over it. I had a tap on my shoulder, and I heard the voice say, "Who did these drawings?" I thought I was going to be arrested or something, and turned around, and it was Bob Kane. He introduced himself. He said, "I just started a new feature, and I need somebody to help me, and I like your work, etc. If you come to New York, I can give you a job." And I was all set to go to Syracuse. He said, "Well, too bad if you came to New York, you could join our team." So I quickly called Columbia to see if my application was still good. Went right from that mountain resort to New York to start Columbia, and ostensibly to join this new comics, which I had never heard of before. So I think the first issue was literally on the stand when he showed it to me.
Were you
so
impressed?
That was it. It was no, I was not impressed.
But you figured it was a good way to make a living for the short term.
Absolutely. I just thought, gee, that's great. I can never anybody paid for drawing and go to Columbia at the same time, which I did for a couple of years, and it was really rough, burning the candle at both ends. I'd draw all night and go to classes during the day.
Did you get a chance to pursue your studies in journalism while you were doing the comic?
Yeah, well, I had to for the first couple of years, and then it became too much. I had to make a choice. So I dropped out of Columbia so I could make a good living drawing and writing.
Were you amazed at how fast you could make a real living at it, kind of while you were going to school, hopefully training to make another living?
Yeah, that was a big surprise. I was able to get paid right away. Then I met Bill Finger immediately. That was the team. It was Bob, myself, and Bill in the beginning.
And did you end up hiring assistants to work with you?
Afterwards, yes. After maybe a year or so, then we hired George Roussos, who did backgrounds and mostly inking backgrounds and lettering. So I was doing all of that until that time. Now became more successful as appearing in several magazines, and so just for the sheer workload, we needed somebody to do some of the inking and lettering.
If you look at Bob Kane's work, both before he did Batman and when he started Batman, and you look, it's relatively simple work. I mean, Peter Pup and the strips that he did are very straightforward. Batman is semi-realistic. Your style is far more refined, let's say, than the stuff that Bob was doing. Did you find there was much difference in terms of how it was portrayed, or did you even think about the fact that an audience would see the difference between styles, or did it make any difference to you?
Well, I try to keep it somewhat in the same genre of Bob's approach, but I had to do my own thing. I didn't just try to imitate it. And luckily they didn't raise any objections at the publishers when I started to do complete stories of my own, pencil and ink, and so there was a difference.
When you did covers, for example, did the editors give you ideas, or did Bob give you ideas for the covers, or did they come out of your own head?
No, I did my own. By that time, I was working right for the publisher. Bill and I left working directly with Bob somewhere between about probably around 41, as I recall. So about maybe a year or so. And then Bill and I began to get offers all over from other publishers who wanted some part of the team that made Batman, So we decided to leave. When DC heard about that, they called us in and made us an offer and to stay with Batman and work directly for them. And so at that point, we kind of divorced from Bob. I worked directly with the editors at DC.
Yeah. Who was your editor then?
Wood Ellsworth was the art editor.
Oh, tell me how the Joker was created.
The Joker was created for Batman #1. When the publishers decided to go ahead with Batman 1, when sales began to go up on the monthly, and all of a sudden we were confronted with doing 4 stories for the quarterly, which were 3 13-page stories and 1 12-page story, plus the monthly detective story, another 13 pages. And then World's Finest started around that time too, so we had another story to do. So it was a big workload. So Bill couldn't write all of those stories at one time. Bill was undoubtedly the best writer in the comics at that time and the most inventive, but he was not a fast writer. It didn't come that naturally. I mean, it came naturally, but it didn't flow. You know, some writers sweat over every page, others, I've known them both. So Bill was not. So we knew that he would be in trouble, and he said that it would be hard for him to meet the deadlines. So I volunteered immediately to write a Batman story, and that was great. And I figured slyly I'd get paid for doing a Batman story, and this would serve as my creative writing credit at Columbia at the same time. That night, I went back to think of what I was going to write about. And I guess literally the first thing I thought of was to start off with the villain. Because from my study of literature, and I was already deeply engrossed in all sorts of reading matter from the classics on up, that all the great heroes in literature and mythology, even in real life, had antagonists. David and Goliath, all the way up to Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty. So that was my first idea, because the villains at that time, reflected the 20s and 30s. That was the era of the gangsters, Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly, the villains in the popular culture. That really flowed after prior era, which were the Western heroes. Well,
Buffalo Bill Cody.
Yeah, that's it.
Penny Dreadfuls at the turn of the
Exactly,
century.
because they were in pulp magazine. Yeah. And that was the progression in the pulps. That was my first thought. We didn't have a really strong villain in Batman. They were all crooks and hijackers and that sort of thing. And nothing that really test Batman's mettle. This, of course, was up Bill's alley too later on, because that really is the kind of thing that Bill was very good at. My first thought was, as I said, to create a villain. I didn't use the word supervillain at that time, like later, but a larger-than-life villain, one that would be memorable, that was worthy of Batman. Interestingly enough, there was a dichotomy at the time that if you made the villain too strong, it would detract from the hero. So I didn't think so from my studies. The villain was important. It would never overshadow the hero in the final result. The hero had to win. But that villains inherently are more interesting than heroes. Heroes are dull. So that was my concept. Everything kind of that you do in life feeds in it somewhere. And when you come to the Joker, all the things I had written in high school and in my college classes so far, I love short stories. I grew up with O. Henry and de Maupassant and Chekhov and all the great writers. And that's who I was thinking of emulating. The other thing that fed into the creation of the Joker, as I can trace it back, playing cards. There were a lot of card playing in my family. One of my brothers, I had 3 elder brothers, the youngest of which was kind of a prodigy. He graduated high school 13 on a full scholarship to Rutgers University, and then graduated Rutgers at the top of his class and got a full scholarship to Yale Law School, which I think he graduated 21 or 22, and maybe the youngest ever. And he played contract bridge, if you know bridge. His auction, which is kind of the simple, and the others, the tournament bridge is his contract. And one time he and his partner won 17 tournaments in a row. They call them master points, like in chess. And my mother was a very expert player, too. She didn't play the tournament bridge, but she was a very fine player. So I played, not in their class, but I liked bridge. And my father played cards. And so I guess that was the association when I was searching. My first idea was for the villain, and then secondly, to think of a name are very important in characters. To think of a name, and I guess it's that association with cards that I thought of the Joker. Well, it's a combination because I was writing humor, and I wanted a villain that had a contradiction in terms, a villain that had a sense of humor to me, that would make it more interesting. And from that, somewhere leapt in the Joker as a name. And then once I thought of that combination, I remember literally that night, 65 years ago, searching frantically in my apartment for a deck of cards, because I remembered that classic image of the jester, on the Joker card. And I thought, that's what he should look like. Something based on that. So luckily I found the card, and that particular brand had that classic concept of the Joker. And so I based the first sketch of the Joker on that Joker of the playing card. And then I thought, well, that would be his calling card. Then I fleshed that out, of course. That was all one night.
And did Bill Finger take to the ideas that he could use?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he thought it was great. And I described the story, roughly what I had in mind. And the playing card, Joker was kind of the master criminal. His idea was to outwit Batman, frustrate Batman, have a joke or some sort of a conundrum in the plot. And Bill wrote that first story, which was perfect. By the way, I was supposed to write it. They loved the idea so much that they turned to me, Bill and Bob, simultaneously and said, well, Bill should write it. He was the best writer. This would be my first one. I guess I could have held out and said, no, it's my case, I'm going to write the first story, which I was dying to do. But I had to admit that Bill was the one to do it. I literally had tears in my eyes when I gave him over my baby for that first story. But Bill did a great job. What he did was he had the classic story. If you read that first story, the closed room, the Joker predicts that he's going to commit a crime at a certain time in a certain place and lets Batman and the police commissioner know, and they try to prevent the crime even though they know the time and place. He's still able to do it. And that was a perfect starting point for the Joker. Arrogance, the humor, the satire, outwitting Batman and the police commissioner Gordon, and that whole setup. And the suspense of how he's going to do it. And that's what Bill was good at.
When you look at the covers that you've done and the stories that you did in 42, 43, there's a broad range of subject in terms of what's placed on the cover. I mean, the bathysphere sitting on the bottom. I look at the tightrope that's going across the buildings, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Did you get a big kick out of taking kind of things that were rolling around in your mind and bringing them to the specific character?
Yeah, that was the fun of it. They made dramatic covers. My idea on the covers, which I loved to do and did a lot of them whenever I could, was, number one, not a scene from the story. Almost never did that, hardly ever. But they were symbolic of the story, or symbolic of the characters. And so I had greater freedom. It gave me greater freedom to placing the story, like the bathysphere. I loved that. That was in the news at the time. Underwater exploration was very exciting. And I saw that shape, which was wonderful, with the portholes. And so I just constructed the whole story in my mind of Robin being trapped in one and Batman trying to save him. Underwater setting. It made a dramatic poster. That was a little more involved than a lot of them. I tried to do to cut it down to its essence, to make them more of a flat poster-like, so that it would be more visible in the stands. You could see it more clearly. I wanted something that was symbolic and designy and reduced to its elements.
Portray a very quick, dramatic moment.
Exactly, because they get all the involvement inside the story, in the pages itself.
So how long did you stay with the Batman character?
It's about 7 years, I think.
So you kind of got started in the business through your work on Batman.
Oh, yeah.
Exploring the medium, kind of experimenting. What got you to change?
7 years I got bored with it. I think most of the creative years on almost any property are the first few years. You're setting the whole sensibility about the strip, or the characters. And thereafter, it's important, of course, and you have to add new characters, but the basic burst of creativity is over. That combined with the fact I wanted to do more of my own thing. I never signed Batman, as you know. In fact, I used to sign Bob Kane's name. I signed it more than he did, ever did. So I wanted to do my own thing. And I began to get offers from all the other publishers. I was known in the field.
Did you know you weren't going to be in the journalist business?
Well,
Was
I never...
there a deciding point where you realized that this is how you're going to make your living?
No, because I never thought of leaving the sense that I was writing and drawing. So to me, that was writing. It wasn't just journalism necessarily to be a reporter or an editor. I was a writer, I guess, in a broader sense. So no, I always thought of combining it, and every time I had an opportunity to write as well as draw, which I did. And over my career, I've written a lot of books and all sorts of articles, catalogs, everything.
So where'd you go after you left the DC character, the Batman?
I freelanced for a number of years, till about the early 50s.
Adam Man and things like that.
Yeah, that was still in the 40s.
Yeah.
Adam Man and...
I mean, did you find artists that you found were similar to your style in terms of being able to put things together the way you had with the George Roussos, sir?
No, well, George wasn't a collaborator, and he was hired by DC too, just to do the backgrounds and lettering. So that was kind of a different situation. Part of the reason for leaving, I wanted to do completely my own thing. I wanted to write the strip. I guess I gave up lettering. I wasn't going to be that much of a perfectionist, but I did do lettering on some of them, when I felt the character of the lettering was important. It wasn't until later that I teamed up with a real partnership with Mort Meskin, and we did a number of features together. Well, he had started with Vigilante and Johnny Quick, and we did those properties together. Then we started Black Terror and Fighting Yank. We worked with Joe Simon and Jack Kirby in some books. I began to teach in early 51 at the School of Visual Arts. Originally it was called Cartoonists and Illustrators, and shortly after that it was changed it to School of Visual Arts. I taught there for almost 10 years, 5 nights a week, 5 hours, after I was doing my own work all day.
Now, did you get a great sense of accomplishment by teaching?
Yes, I really enjoyed teaching. It gave me the chance to study, which I never did, study hard. And you learn a lot by teaching. And I had to codify and understand how I came to certain conclusions only by drawing and trial and error over the years. Why I conceived a certain way, why I told the story a certain way. And to put that into words and convey it to a student, I really had to analyze what I was doing.
Did it refine the way
Yeah, I think my work proved dramatically during that time. I had a lot of students. Some of my class were 30 to 40 students. And Steve Ditko was a student of mine, and a number of others who made it in the field. So I really enjoyed it and got a lot of feedback and took a lot of notes I thought I'd write a book about. Yeah, I was very serious about it. Got absorbed in really the art of communicating.
Did it help redefine your career at that point, you think?
I think in a way it did. One thing it led to was a meeting with Stan Lee. What I would do in the class, I'd invite down some leading people in the field to talk to the class. What I also did was when a student showed some promise, I would call a publisher and say, I have a student who's very good at lettering or very good at backgrounds or do layouts, and get them started in the field. I remember one year, and this is in the 50s, the class in toto earned about $30,000 while they were students. So they were looking for talent. The school was also founded on every member of the faculty were working artists. It wasn't theoretical. So as I say, I was doing my own work all day and taught at night, and then sometimes I'd go back again to meet deadlines at 11 o'clock at night. But anyway, that was a good way of breaking into the field. So I had Stan down as a guest one time. I don't know if we even had met before that. But I just called him as an editor at one of the publishers to talk about field, what they were looking for, to address the students and so on. And so we got to know each other then, and he said, gee, I'd love to have you do some things for us. That was timely at the time. I said, okay, maybe I'll think about it. I was doing more writing then and teaching and some other freelance, I forget what I was doing, maybe illustration. So I went up and started with Stan, which would last for almost 10 years. I did a lot of work for Timely, with Stan as editor. And he was a good editor because he never bothered me. In fact, I brought in the complete story and that was it.
It's a good requisite, isn't it?
Yes.
If he doesn't bother you, he's good. Did you use your students ever as assistants, or did you end up doing all your own work and then recommending them for other things?
At that time, I just recommended for other things. But later on, I did hire students to assist me until they got able to do their own things completely. But some worked for me for some years. In fact, one of them became a partner after he assisted me a couple of years. And we did books together, and then we made him a partner. Two of them, as a matter of fact. Bob Forgione, who did a lot of very good work in the comics, who was also a student, and I hired him from my class. He then broke into advertising. He was so good at visualizing. Well, this is what I kind of accented with my classes, storytelling. So it was perfect for storyboarding. And he was very fast, and he learned all his drawing. We learned to draw everything out of our heads quickly. And so he did terrifically as storyboard and made a lot of money in advertising. He was so good they made him vice president of a top agency.
I want to talk a little bit about your role in the National Cartoonist Society and the fight with Time Warner. How did you become president of the National Cartoonist Society?
By getting more votes than
Did you feel a responsibility to be active in terms of forwarding the ideals of the individual artists and making sure that they were represented properly?
Yeah, well, I guess I was always talking about being a liberal and idealist, young, and I was. And I saw the Cartoonist Society as a great opportunity to do something, worthwhile in the field, and to make it more professional. At that time, the society was kind of in the throes of an evolutionary change. It was founded by mostly comic strip guys, and it was kind of a marching and chowder society. And the younger ones, I think, starting with Mort Walker, when I first joined, or first became active in the society, Mort Walker was president, and he started to make a change to make it more professional. Harry Devlin was one of the leaders in making it more professional, and I fell into that group. I think immediately I proposed we had monthly meetings at that time. It was a tremendous job. President, he had to stage a meeting every month with something interesting. So I immediately started to have an exhibition every meeting of someone's work, have an outstanding guest from our profession or others at the meeting every month. I found it was almost a full-time job. I was spending half my time on the society. I even went to the extent of designing a new invitation that was interesting for each meeting based on the guests. So it was kind of a fun thing. Each one was a completely different design. I would go outside the field like I'd have Burgess Meredith, Zero Mostel, Red Smith, the top sports writer of the Times at the time, and Dolly came in with 2 Russian wolfhounds or something. And we were meeting a lot at the Lambs Club in New York, the theatrical club. A lot of my meetings also were at the Illustrators Society, which is a very lovely building. East side had more of an art ambience. And we met there. The illustrators had a sketch room tiers for a live model to pose. So I'd have a model session before the meeting. Cartoonists came and could draw a live model, so that was provocative. You'd see people like Otto Soglo drawing a new model, and I'd post them afterwards. And then I had a shop talk and an exhibition, and a model and a guest of honor for the evening. So it really made an exciting full-time evening. For example, one time, on more serious notes, I had an evening devoted to integration in the comics, how blacks were then being integrated into the comics for the first time. What it used to be, the stereotypes of blacks in the comics, which were really, when you look back, really horrible. There was an article in the paper, in Ebony magazine, talking to that point about how blacks were treated in the comics. And that's great, so I called Ebony and got her name. Bonchita Pierce was the writer. And I invited her to the evening, devoted to integration. I invited the top textbook writers in the country who I knew, who personally integrated textbooks, which were pure white before that. And how he did it was he was so well respected that he could write his own ticket. He had that leverage with the companies. Texas was the big state. Whatever Texas board decided on, they bought so many books that they kind of dictated what went into the books, and they were the last barrier. They didn't want their textbooks integrated. That meant in the text and in the pictures. You see the black and white kids studying school and so forth. And so he said he wouldn't do the textbook unless it was integrated. And that's how he integrated the textbook. So I had him and his wife were the top writers at that meeting. I had a young black cartoonist who was doing a black superhero at the time to get published. A whole variety of people on that evening. It turned out, just a sidelight, that this Bonchita Pierce, a beautiful woman, but quite young, and a good friend of hers, I can't remember her name, but if you remember when Nelson Rockefeller died, he had a heart attack in his office where he was having a rendezvous with a young lady. He passed out at a crucial moment, and she's stuck there. I don't know if you better cut to all this.
I remember the news story.
Well, her good friend was Bonchita Pierce, who she called to come over to the office to extricate herself from Nelson. I guess I was called a half Nelson. Or maybe it was a whole Nelson. A full Nelson.
How did you end up taking up the cause with Siegel and Shuster in their battle to keep title to their character?
Right. Well, that was long after I was president of the Siegel and Shuster affair. But I drew upon my contacts then and as past president. Well, I learned about, they were both good friends of mine. Joe worked at the next desk to me at D.C. by the time he was actually working there. We even went on double dates together. He liked tall, 6-foot blondes. I had great difficulty in finding him dates that qualified for that. We were very close friends, so when I heard about their plight, they had moved to California. So I had lost direct contact with them for a couple of years. Suddenly, Jerry appeared on a TV show, popped up in the audience, and explained, his plight. I had thought, along with most of the others in the field, that a settlement had been made that guaranteed him an annuity and so forth. And it proved not to be true. And he was, destitute. So I immediately called him in California. And I learned that at the same time, Neil Adams, who didn't know him, also had called to offer his support. So Neil and I got together to wage this battle on their behalf. At that time, the Superman movie was in the works, the first one. And that was our big leverage. We knew that they didn't want any bad publicity about the creators of Superman starving, and they're making this billion-dollar movie. I decided to wage public relations. To fight it legally would have taken a number of other years. I knew from the beginning that Jerry and Joe wanted to wind up with some settlement, the best we could do, because they were at the end of their legal rope in terms of time and money. They had fought this already for several decades. So I thought our best chance was to garner public opinion and professional opinion. We wrote articles for the paper. I met with the editors of the New York Times, the Washington Post. They wrote columns. I wrote our artists. I had already had the syndicate, and I wrote our artists abroad. They had articles planned in Mexico and London and Paris about the plight of the Superman creators. Advised all sorts of things of that nature. And then began open negotiations with them directly. This was now with Time Warner, who had bought the DC property. So we weren't dealing with the original owners anymore, who had to justify, their past decision. So it was a more, I think, enlightened management. I think if it happened today, that wouldn't have happened. So, but they drew a hard line, the original owners. So luckily, Time Warner were ones we were negotiating with. Although one of them was a relative, I think, of Donenfeld or Leibowitz, one of the others. And in the merger, he got the position with Time Warner. But essentially, it was different management. I also contacted all the professional groups, Writers Guild, Screenwriters Guild, Illustrator Society, advertising people, and of course NCS, which leads back to the National Cartoonist Society. Well, one of my successors as president, who was then president at that time of NCS, was Bill Gallo, who was the top sports cartoonist for the New York Daily News. So I called Bill, told him about the plight, and he said, great, suggest we have a board meeting and pass some resolution and the weight of our society on their behalf. So, of course, Bill immediately agreed to this, and we had a big meeting of the board. We invited Jerry and Joe to come to the meeting. We wrote a resolution in support of their position. In fact, I wrote it out quickly at that meeting. And just coincidentally, the magazine cartoonists, which are mostly New Yorker cartoonists and Gag magazine, had their own organization. And they were meeting the same day. And I remember racing over from our NCS meeting to their meeting. I knew the director, and so he gave me the floor to address their annual meeting. Just out of the blue, they knew nothing about it. I explained the Siegel and Shuster story and the Superman, as succinctly as I could. And, they immediately came to support. So I read the resolution, they passed it unanimously. So I was armed with that, and the NCS one, and I went to the other organizations, and I contacted leading people that I knew that had some clout, like Jules Pfeiffer, Kurt Vonnegut I knew from the Cape, and I called him any name that I could garner, to write letters or issue statements. And so that had an effect. They went into negotiations because they began to see this publicity in articles from all over. So it was a very intense negotiations for a week or so. At the very end, the thing that they were holding out on, which I was particularly incensed about and wanted to have as part of the agreement, was to restore their names, the property. They were holding out on that. I think, from my understanding, mostly on legal grounds. They were afraid that if they put their name back, there might be some way that would entitle them to part ownership. There's more of a claim of their copyright ownership. I think that was the root of their reluctance, among probably other reasons. But that was, I thought, very, very important psychologically for Jerry and Joe after the turmoil they had in their life. Really horrible circumstances. I don't have time to describe now. But knowing them, I heard really horror stories. And one of the things that hurt them most was their creation. It was part of their self-respect that they created this property. Jerry, when he walked by a theater that was showing a Superman movie or a play or a magazine, he would literally get sick to his stomach. He could no longer write it, developed a writer's block. He could no longer write for a living, earning a living as sorting mail in a government building. The creator of Superman was a mailman. Joe was certifiably blind. He had bad eyes even when I knew him. He had to work like this, and later he couldn't draw at all. And he was supported by a brother who earned a minimal living as a draftsman. And they had a small apartment in the Bronx where he was supporting. So that was their plight, mind you. They're creators and destitute. They didn't have money for lawyers anymore. They'd run through a number of pro bono lawyers, but it was extended so long. In effect, they had created a Frankenstein. They were now a billion-dollar company and could afford all the best lawyers, and all they had to do was protracted negotiation. So that's where we stood, and I felt the only thing we could win is by bringing public support to bear on it and public awareness of their plight. And Jerry himself took the first steps. I think he instinctively knew that too. He had exhausted the legal ramifications and personal appeals and whatnot, and he was going public. And that was the only thing that was left. Well, jumping to the night before the last, which proved to be the last negotiation, after every day we would call Joe. Jerry was really the one that we dealt with. They were together and they were the best friends for all their lives. And Jerry said, look, he had already had a heart attack. I would call Jerry after each day to tell him the progress. Well, this would prove to be the next to last day. I called. He said, settle it tomorrow for the best you can get, because I don't think I'll last very long. He said, if something happens to me, I won't have anything to leave to them if an agreement isn't signed. He was concerned about his wife and child. So we had directed to come to an agreement the next day. Well, that was a terrible situation to be in, because I had to try to negotiate the best possible terms, but yet knowing I had to come to an agreement. If you press too hard, well, maybe they might walk away from the table. To avoid that happening the next day, I thought I'd take a shortcut. Jay Emmett. He had given me his home number in case I had to reach him for something during these negotiations. So I decided to call him that night after a late night call to Jerry, who said he's afraid something happened and settled the next day. So I called Jay and I said, in effect, look, I think we could settle this tomorrow if we agree on the following things. And I gave a substantial increase in their settlement, leading up to what I thought was the last important thing, was restoring their name. They're proud of their creation. It's a matter of humanity to restore their self-respect. And I said, more than that, no matter what we settle, it's not going to be accepted by the arts community if you don't restore their name. I said, you depend on the arts. In their whole organization of Time Warner, and films, music, books, everything. I said, we're going to rally that whole community. They're not going to accept that. They're all writers and creators. I said, you don't take the name off of Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle off of Sherlock Holmes because he's dead. You don't take Shakespeare off of Hamlet because he's out of copyright. I said, you got to put their names on it. He said, well, this is about 10 or 11 o'clock at night. He says, well, I'll call you back in an hour. In an hour, he calls back, and I knew he had to talk to his lawyers. And he said, I give it to you in the print matter, which is great. This is what I want in the books. But I can't give it to you on the toys or licensing or the film, which was then production. So I said, no, it's got to be on everything. I'll call you back in an hour. So meanwhile, we got the print matter. So he called back. This time it's 1 o'clock in the morning or something. And he's calling up his lawyers every hour to wake them up. He called back and he says, well, we can't do it on the franchise. It's too difficult. All the toys are made and whatnot. So I said, I'll give you the toys, but it's got to be on the film. He said, we can't do the film because the credits are already made. I said, Jay, you run a new screen on the credits. You don't have to shoot new scenes. I guess he still thought that he was talking to somebody who didn't know anything about the business. You can get away with stuff. I said, no, you can run a new credit. I'll call you back. That was the last call. And he called back and says, okay, you got films and print, but no toys about it. And you got a deal. And the next day we signed the agreement. Jerry and Joe flew in from California. And the last bit of the story, which might be worth telling, we signed it. And so all the other principals were there, broke out champagne, And the other thing is we gathered around the television set because we had promised Walter Cronkite the scoop on the story when we signed. We'd tell him, and he would do a special on it. So we're all gathered around the set waiting for his story with Cronkite, and he doesn't give it and doesn't get it. And he saved it for his sign-off story. And then he tells it. And the last sign-off was, and after he tells the stories, and finally, truth, justice, and the American way run out. And he has a Superman flying over on the screen.
And that's the way it is.
And everybody in the room, we had champagne. There was no dry eye in the house. Here's with Jerry and Joe, toasting. So that was the final of it.
Fabulous. And that's the way it is.
And that's the way it is.